Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Aaron Bastani. Tonight I have the immense pleasure of being joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG, with her customary violet, lilac, purple lighting. How are we, Helena?
I'm doing very well, Aaron. Looking forward to the show today. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we won't get hounded by any kind of committee for defending democracy for saying things that people from the Labour right don't like tonight.
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of years before that sort of thing starts to emerge. Coming up on tonight's show, Donald Trump has chosen his running mate for the presidential election. Who is Trump's VP? Current President Joe Biden has said that he has done more for the Palestinians than anyone else. And we'll look ahead to the King's speech tomorrow and what will and will not be offered by Keir Starmer's government. Welsh First Minister Vaughan Gething has announced his resignation as leader of the Welsh government. This was Gething laying out his reasons for stepping down.
A growing assertion that some kind of wrongdoing has taken place has been pernicious, politically motivated, and patently untrue. In 11 years as a minister, I have never, ever made a decision for personal gain. I have never, ever misused or abused my ministerial responsibilities. My integrity matters. I have not compromised it. I regret that the burden of proof is no longer an important commodity in the language of our politics. I do hope that can change for all of us. I will now discuss with the Welsh Executive a timetable for the election of a new leader of Welsh Labour.
Gething was only elected as leader in March, meaning his resignation today makes him the shortest serving First Minister in Wales's history. And his 118 days in office have perhaps also been amongst the most turbulent that the devolved government in Cardiff has seen. Just days after his election in March, Gething refused to return a £200,000 donation made to his leadership campaign. That money had come from a man called David John Neal. He'd been twice convicted of environmental offences in Wales, and it later emerged that Gething, while a minister, had previously written to Natural Resources Wales, the body charged with protecting Wales's environment, asking them to relax restrictions on Neal's company, Atlantic Recycling, in his constituency. On BBC Wales, Gething explained why he wasn't giving the money back.
This is a little frustrating because every serious journalist knows that in your constituency, you're not entitled to make decisions as a minister.
I won't take that personally.
No, but the way that the story has been run, with a suggestion there must be something going on, actually, it's impossible for me to do that. I cannot make a decision as a minister in my constituency. And it's
this perception, isn't it? The ministerial code means it's not just that whether there is bias or not, whether there's this perception of bias. You know, it is damaging, is it not? Even your own party saying there's a huge amount of anger within the Labour Party about this.
There are two things there again. The first is the perception. Well, if you're saying that you're not allowed to do things in your constituency, then you'd never be able to be an effective constituency representative. You have to be both. So I think there's a fundamental misreading of the ministerial code. And you don't have to take my word for it. The current First Minister, Mark Drakeford, is very clear. There is no breach of the code.
Just quickly, I find his whole shtick there, repeatedly as well, throughout this whole episode, to be so strange. I know better. You're wrong. Here's why you're wrong, by the way. When you are facing such serious allegations, that doesn't seem to be the right approach to me. But what do I know? I'm not a now disgraced First Minister. All of that wasn't the end of Gething's troubles, however. He'd also been Welsh Minister for Health and Social Services during the height of the COVID pandemic. And early this year, Gething gave testimony to the government's inquiry into the COVID response. In it, he implied that all information contained on his two Senedd phones during the pandemic had been handed over to the inquiry. But days later, a screenshot of a ministerial group chat emerged. At the bottom, you can see Gething telling ministers this: "I'm deleting the messages in this group. They can be captured in a Freedom of Information requisition, and I think we're all in the right place on the choice being made." Gething denied the accusation that he'd perjured himself at the COVID inquiry. Instead, he sacked Cabinet Minister Hannah Blythyn in May, accusing her of leaking those messages to the press. Blythyn denied that she was involved in the leak. Less than a month later, Gething faced a confidence motion in the Senedd and lost. Despite that, he refused to step down as First Minister, dismissing the vote as, quote, a gimmick. This morning, however, his position became untenable after 4 cabinet ministers resigned. Gething quit just hours later. Now, Gething isn't only Wales's shortest-lived First Minister, he's also the country's first black leader. And that was an achievement he made reference to in his resignation speech to the Senedd.
To those people in Wales who look like me, many of whom I know feel personally bruised and worried by this moment, I know that our country can be better, must be better. I know that cannot happen without us. There will and there must be in a future a government that looks like the country it serves. A government for all of us to make Wales a better place with and for all of us.
I find this stuff bewildering, frankly. There's a clear conflict of interest. You've clearly not behaved, responsibly, appropriately. You're telling colleagues to delete messages because they might be requisitioned. You're overtly saying it. You're not saying, hey, look, I'm going to clean this because I fancy a break. He's overtly saying, look, we don't want to do the right thing after all. People in the future might actually hold us accountable for what we did during the COVID crisis. Equally, he won't take responsibility for taking this huge donation. Look, in British politics, taking £200,000 is a huge donation. In Welsh politics, it's unheard of. But he's making it sound like he took the dog out for a walk and ordered a cup of coffee, all in a day's work. And of course, if you say this is strange, he talks about how he's the first black leader of Wales. I have a certain set of views on this stuff. I think it's ridiculous. I think it offers a cover for, frankly, unacceptable political conduct. But we'll talk about that more in a moment. Gething's resignation comes at a time when Labour's fortunes in Wales are in decline. Sort of. Because while they may have gained MPs in the general election earlier this month, the party did see a 4% drop in their vote share. Meanwhile, Plaid Cymru saw an almost 5% increase. Meanwhile, Reform gained almost 17% at the polls following the collapse of the Tory party. And some of Labour's biggest hitters in Wales only narrowly kept their seats. One of those was Nia Griffith, former Shadow Welsh Secretary under Keir Starmer. She held her seat by just 1,500 votes against the challenger from Reform. Next year, elections for the Senedd will be held with the Welsh Government in disarray and beset by scandal, and Reform and Plaid Cymru on the up. The question is whether Labour will be able to hold on to its majority, or if it will come to depend on Plaid Cymru for only the second time ever to form a government. Helena, I'm interested in what you think about this. Of course, neither of us are Welsh. That's a shame. We did have a Welsh guest, but they're not joining us right now. But in terms of this crisis for Wales, there is a parallel to what we see in the rest of the UK, certainly in England, which is that when the Labour right don't have something their way, they burn these institutions to the ground. What's your view on this? Is the conduct of Vaughan Gething, as somebody from the Labour right, is that readily comprehensible to somebody in England who's got obviously a great deal of experience observing similar characters?
I mean, I think we're always going to see the kind of electoral fallout from these things happening. I think I find it very interesting that you mention how this has affected people in kind of South Wales, in Cardiff area specifically. Someone tweeted a graphic onto my timeline on Twitter yesterday showing a turnout map of the UK, showing how people felt who were showing up the areas of the UK essentially graded by how much people turned out in those specific areas. And you can see really and truly, right, the big impact of when the Labour right throw a hissy fit and decide to essentially alienate huge swathes of people by not actually engaging in the important things that you need to create a governing coalition and just focusing on kind of short-term gain for their own benefit. the places in the country which saw the hugest kind of drop in turnout, all inner city areas, right? Just like you see some of the lowest turnouts in the country, places like Cardiff, for example. Also, that same thing was happening in the northeast, in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Leeds, in East London as well. And these were all places that were kind of formerly Labour heartlands, and they're essentially being torched for short-term gain, both internally within the party and, of course, long-term in terms of how they view themselves pandering to certain demographics electorally. And any kind of concerns for the role of governance, any kind of concerns for like the protection of democratic accountability, that has to go by the wayside in terms of short-term electoral gain. And this is where I've always been a large critic of the Labour rights strategy, because it's all essentially entirely done with a huge kind of set of blinkers on as to the large-scale ramifications of what happens with this kind of shithousery.
To what extent can somebody benefit from that or take advantage of that? It's one thing that confidence collapses in an institution. It's another thing actually for people to take advantage of that. I'll come back to you, Helena, because it's something we've heard about a lot, declining trust in politics, declining trust in the two-party system. It doesn't matter until somebody comes along and takes advantage. And I think the classic example here is, of course, Reform. We've not really had a party that's challenging Labour and the Tories in their own heartlands. The Lib Dems have their seats. They've not really broken out of it until this election because of the collapse of the Tories. But as a separate political entity trying to take on both parties, trying to become very much a national party, you saw a little bit with UKIP. I mean, they came second in 120 seats in 2015. But of course, that was about leaving the EU. Once you leave the EU, UKIP doesn't really have a point anymore. And it feels that Reform is filling that function in England, less so in Scotland, although, of course, they may overtake the Tories. That's not particularly hard. But I find this in Wales really interesting because as a Celtic nation, I know that lefties in Wales have tried to present the Welsh body politic as, inherently progressive, very similar sort of messaging to what you hear in Scotland. We're different to England. But actually, UKIP back in the day did very well. There was a very strong Leave vote. Yes, it's, of course, culturally, politically very different to England. But it does also feel that Labour vote, so solid, until recently, I think probably still is actually the most successful national political entity, particularly now the SNP have collapsed, anywhere in Europe, arguably, actually. If you look at their share of the vote, where they're in the Senedd with Welsh MPs and whatnot, it does feel, though, that's quite soft. When people are voting for you that tribally, it can go very quickly, as Labour saw in 2015. What are your thoughts?
I mean, we saw at the general election, Wales was the area of the UK where the Labour vote actually decreased from where it was in 2019, not just in terms of raw vote count, but in terms of share of the votes as well. And Reform UK are clearly poised to take votes away from people living in post-industrial communities, where there's a lot of these in Wales very specifically, but dotted all over kind of the north of the UK as well. Because there are plenty of places in the UK specifically that will never vote Conservative. Like they will completely refuse to vote Conservative based upon the history of what the party, what it represents to them, to their communities, to the people who've told them about what Margaret Thatcher represented and what the Conservative Party still represents, especially this kind of English nationalist version of the Conservative Party that kind of exists in 2024. Yet Reform UK have a completely different kind of method of campaigning, a different method of delivery, a different kind of base that they're trying to tap into. You mentioned you had a great article on Novara's website, Aaron, talking about Reform UK trying to capture this idea of popular capitalism. This idea that, well, of course, capitalism is fine, but it's just the corporations that are the problem, right? If we bring back all of your local businesses, for example, if you bring back your industry, which you've got to remember, as well as being a Thatcher problem, is also a Blair problem. The drop in these kind of heartland communities of the Labour vote all across the country, both in Wales and places like the north as well, in these deindustrialised areas, was precipitated by Blair's continuation of deindustrialisation. And that is the kind of people who would never vote Conservative, because Thatcher and Blair are one and the same in terms of that whole kind of demographic. But Reform UK is a new political entity, essentially saying that, well, we understand your gripes with these things, plus there are some play out groups that we can kind of tie this to as well, what happened in the interim. That's a certain political force that can attack these heartland communities in a way that the Conservative never can from the right, especially by changing the rhetoric somewhat and by also not having all of the party political baggage. Because, look at what's happening in Port Talbot, for example. Are Labour going to actually save it? Are they going to nationalise it, for example? Like this is going to be the test here, because it's the politics. Apart from a very short period of the last 45 years, Labour have been happy to go along with the Conservative Party playbook on this. And Reform UK coming along and saying, well, actually, we need to have our infrastructure 50% owned by UK pension funds and 50% by the state. That's far more radical than you're getting a proposal in terms of this kind of economic nationalism and this kind of protectionism that these people kind of support. And that's really been abandoned by Labour, I guess, kind of until Rachel Reeves started talking about an industrial strategy. So this could be very interesting politically in the years ahead.
So true. And also, another reform policy, which I don't agree with, and by the way, if I talk about a policy, it doesn't mean I support it, is that they want to increase military spending to 3% of GDP. And of course, that would mean a hell of a lot of procurement of defense goods that are manufactured right here in the UK, which, guess what, require steel. So, and that's the principal argument, by the way, that somebody like Farage would make in order to keep steel production going in this country. It's about having an independent military production capability. It's deeply worrying, I think, that Labour can't make those arguments wholeheartedly, and yet Reform can. We're seeing something similar right now, by the way, with shipbuilding in Northern Ireland. It's a real test for Labour. It is a real test for Labour. Their honeymoon is not going to last as long as they'd probably like. Normally, when you win an election, you get a bit of an easy time over the summer months. But I don't think that's the case here. And interestingly enough, there are big implications as well with regards to our next story and the changing relationship between the left and the right on things like blue-collar issues and industrial policy. Donald Trump has been confirmed as the Republican Party's candidate for the upcoming US presidential election. That choice had pretty much been a certainty for months. Less clear, though, was who Trump would choose as his VP, his vice presidential running mate. In a Truth Social post shortly after his confirmation, Trump announced it would be this man. J.D. Vance, a Republican senator for Ohio since his election last year, a lawyer by training, he worked for several years in venture capital and finance, and also served with the US Marine Corps in the Second Iraq War. That is the start of the almost perfect American political CV, and he's backed by big money too. The billionaire co-founder of PayPal, Peter Thiel, was Vance's one-time employer at venture capital fund Mithril. Thiel helped fund Vance's Senate run to the tune of $15 million. According to Politico, that's the largest sum ever given to an individual candidate in a Senate race. But while Vance may enjoy wide support among Silicon Valley tech elites, he has a background that some say uniquely connects him with blue-collar Republicans. Until Trump picked him as his vice presidential candidate, Vance was probably best known as an author. In 2016, he published his best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which later became a Ron Howard film. I don't want to upset anybody, but I rather enjoyed it. In the book, Vance recounts growing up in an impoverished rural community in Appalachia. It's a story of abuse, addiction, and eventually personal triumph. On publication, some reviewers saw it as providing a unique insight into the success of Trump's 2016 campaign with blue-collar America. Remember, of course, it was places like Pennsylvania, Iowa, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin that got Trump over the line, switching from blue to red. But others criticized the novel for denigrating the working class and ignoring the political and structural conditions that lead to poverty. In any case, it's these two poles of tech capitalism and a blue-collar background that have made Vance the de facto leader of the Washington New Right, associated with outfits like the Heritage Foundation and policy programs like National Conservatism. They argue for economic protectionism, anti-immigration, escalating culture wars, and an isolationist foreign policy. It's a worldview that supports the dismantling of what its adherents call the, quote, regime, a technocratic elite running the government. And in pressing that view, Vance's language has at times been fiery. In a 2021 speech, he compared the battle against the regime to the American Civil War, saying this: It may not be as bad as it was in the 1860s, that we're going through a fiery trial. The people in this room are the people who are going to be in the vanguard of a conservative movement that fights back against its enemies instead of just taking it. If our enemies are using guns and bazookas, then we had better fight back with more than wet noodles. We need to use the same means if we're actually going to win this fight. And I'm not in this to lose. I'm in this to win. Some of Vance's previous policy statements give a sense of where he stands on the big issues. Domestically, he believes in protectionist trade tariffs on imports, especially from China. He's also opposed to abortion rights and lauded the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, posting this on social media at the time. If your worldview tells you that it's bad for women to become mothers, but liberating for them to work 90 hours a week in a cubicle at the New York Times or Goldman Sachs, you've been had. He recently praised Hungarian President Viktor Orban's policies aimed at raising the birth rate through cash incentives and argued that people with children should get more votes than the childless. On Trump, Vance previously claimed that the 2020 presidential election was, quote, stolen from Trump, and called arrested January 6th protesters, quote, political prisoners. But he hasn't always been a fan of his new presidential running mate. In messages sent to his former law school roommate in 2016, Vance said this: I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical asshole like Nixon, who wouldn't be that bad and might even prove useful, or that he's America's Hitler. How's that for discouraging? In the New York Times last month, Vance clarified his thinking of 8 years earlier. Like a lot of other elite conservatives and elite liberals, I allowed myself to focus so much on the stylistic element of Trump that I completely ignored the way in which he substantively was offering something very different on foreign policy, on trade, on immigration. On the topic of foreign policy, this is what Vance said about Ukraine in February this year. There is frankly no good reason that aid from the US should be needed. Europe is made up of many great nations with productive economies. They ought to have the capacity to handle the conflict. But over decades, they've become far too weak. America has been asked to fill the void at tremendous expense to its own citizens. And Vance has some interesting views about the UK's new Labour government too. This was him speaking at a national conservatism conference just last week.
I have to beat up on the UK just one additional thing. I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over.
Helena, I found this strange for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's obviously an outrageous way for a US Republican to speak about their number one ally. I mean, there is no bigger ally of the US right than the British right. You've got Liz Truss over there right now singing their praises. Just sort of purely from a foreign policy perspective, it seems kind of short-termist. Whatever. Even stranger still, I saw British conservative journalists, influencers sharing that video saying, lol, haha, he can speak the truth. We're in a very weird moment, aren't we, right now, where you have the sort of right in this country increasingly influenced by the US right, the Trump right, beating up on their own country. So I suppose that's one thing to think about. But also, J.D. Vance is a very well-read man. He's not stupid, as his CV would indicate. Is it fair to say that he is somebody who might give intellectual ballast to the Trump presidency, and that actually that makes it politically far more dangerous?
With his comments that he'd made just there, it just shows you the kind of one-way relationship that the US and the UK have, in which that they will continually denigrate us over and over and over again, really and truly. They do this constantly, especially on the Republican side. They will continue to denigrate the UK, and we will just continue to just take their line on all foreign policy decisions because we know that they're the ones with all the power. They're the ones who have the power in this relationship, and they can do whatever we want. And we just have to play ball in terms of the quote-unquote special relationship. Although you say when, of course, the Conservatives are happy to trash their own country and essentially import a lot of kind of US think tank-based propaganda into the UK, it doesn't work. Like you've seen UK conservatives, they talk about critical race theory and they talk about trans people, and then this is not relevant to anybody. And it's just another reason why they fell out of touch and why they got booted out so forcefully of the last general election. What is interesting, though, when you talk about him, his appeal to voters and his kind of more intellectual rigor that he places, and I do think that he's definitely far more of a thinking man than anybody in the kind of Trump wing of the party is currently. I think the real strategic decision that they've made with the J.D. Vance appointment is this connection to the Rust Belt of America. The people, obviously, he's a senator in Ohio currently, so he definitely represents the Rust Belt in terms of his own kind of political upbringing. But in terms of the kind of policies that you, as you say, this is definitely geared towards these, because these are all the swing states, right? Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, all of those states are must-wins for the Trump campaign if they want to be able to beat Biden in the election later on this year. So by trying to appeal to them by having somebody from that background who parrots the kind of policies that they want to kind of hear is something that's possible for them to do. Of course, these are all states that voted Trump in 2016 because of the people in these areas who felt the poor end of deindustrialization. Similar to what happened to the UK under Thatcher and Blair, under people like Bill Clinton, for example, the deindustrialization of these kind of heartland, previously very democratic states, that absolutely disintegrated. And Hillary Clinton made this complete pitfall in 2016, assuming she didn't have to do proper campaigning in these seats when they'd been turning redder and redder over time because of the failure of any industrial policy from the government to ensure these people kept their jobs. Look at Detroit, for example. The issue, of course, though, is that this isn't 2016 anymore. This isn't 2016 at all. And after 4 years of democratic governance, they are the ones who are trying to actually do proper industrial policy that benefits all of these districts. And we can see this in terms of the kind of polling we're seeing in Senate races in all of these swing seats, right? In Ohio, even specifically, Sherrod Brown is leading in this Senate race in current polling. And that's probably a properly red state now. John Fetterman won his Senate race in an even bigger margin than Biden won in the presidential election in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, they're looking to keep another Senate seat. In gubernatorial races like Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro, they keep winning those as well. They win Senate seats and gubernatorial races all across the sheet in all of these states. And it shows you the strategic policy that Democrats have put in place to keep these states on side after the last election. The big fiscal policies were advocated for by Bernie Sanders and his economic advisors, people like Stephanie Kelton, ensuring that you essentially use what is kind of like a rudimentary form of modern monetary theory to inject huge amounts of new cash into reindustrializing parts of the country. And now that they are seeing the material benefits of this, they're not going to be won over by kind of culture war discourse and this kind of these appeals to social policy and kind of nationalist conservatism, even if they are saying the kind of the right lines with things like economic protectionism. Like the actual government that's put in the fiscal framework to actually reindustrialize these places of the country is coming from the Democrats. And the Republicans will literally try and take benefit for this. They'll try and claim that they are the ones who are responsible for it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, ran a huge thing about all the jobs that had come back to Georgia's 14th. I was like, yeah, this was government funding from the federal government funding that came from the infrastructure bill, from the Inflation Reduction Act. So when you actually look at the people who are now staying blue in these districts, I don't think J.D. Vance is going to have enough cut through with these particular demographics to be able to win them over in terms of basic material interest, in terms of their quality of life.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I don't think he's going to be the game changer in these seats that matter, in these states that matter. But it does speak to where is viewed as necessary to win, which is precisely these places that Trump won in 2016, generally failed with in 2020. It is a really interesting one because he is, like I say, very well read, but he's also kind of stupid. He says really stupid things, and I don't think necessarily he believes all of them. He's somebody who's clearly very good at courting controversy, getting attention. There was one clip which really caught my mind. We didn't have time to put it up today, but he talked about the Democratic establishment. He talked about corporate capitalism, and then he blamed America's ills on childless cat ladies. His words. It does seem a rather strange sort of critique of power to go from the Democratic establishment, ESG, a certain kind of capitalism. I get all that. I don't agree with all that analysis, but I understand what you're talking about. And then he goes, well, of course, we're talking about women with no children who love cats. Very odd. We're going to be seeing a lot more of him anyway. Lots of crazy videos of him circulating. But an interesting figure. But I have to agree, this idea that he's going to speak to certain states that Trump can't reach. Trump is a singular figure when it comes to stuff in American politics. Water bills are going up. That's true wherever you live and whichever company provides you with your water. But they're going up most of all in the south of England. Southern Water provides services for Sussex, much of Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And they're majority owned by Australian investment bank Macquarie, the former owner of Thames Water. The company had recently asked the water regulator Ofwat to approve a 73% rise in household bills over the 5 years to 2030. That was before inflation, and the biggest proposed price hike of any water company in England. So basically, you could expect your bills to double over the next 6 years if Southern Water was your provider. But Ofwat pushed back, saying that bills could only rise by 44%. Thank goodness for that. Thank you, Ofwat. In any case, expect a massive price rise if Southern is your provider. The reason for that increase is probably familiar to many of you. It's because there has been very little money spent on the infrastructure of Southern Water when it's been needed. It's been underinvested in, frankly, since privatisation 35 years ago. What is more, Southern has net debts of £5.7 billion. Again, a reminder, it had zero debts when it was privatised. In fact, if you're a Southern customer, 27% of your bill is spent servicing the company's debts. The company has also paid out $2.3 billion in dividends since it was privatised. So, in other words, much of the debt it's taken on was effectively given to shareholders. You are servicing a debt so somebody else somewhere could get rich, not to make the service any better. So far, so familiar. But here's a really extraordinary story that has just emerged. Because it turns out the boss of Southern Water, one Lawrence Gosden, received a £183,000 bonus after proposing that customers should face a 73% rise in bills. On precisely what basis Gosden deserved that bonus is unclear. After all, Ofwat would later tell the company to rewrite its, quote, inadequate business plan, saying it did not meet the minimum standards. So this guy can't do the basics, wants to whack up your bills, continue to provide a dreadful service, and still get a salary and bonus of £764,000. What other industry works like that? I want to know. Maybe I'll apply for a job. Gosden wasn't alone either. The company's chief financial officer, Stuart Ledger, was given a £128,000 bonus, taking his total pay to £610,000. This was all after the fact that in 2023, Southern Water polluted waterways for over 317,000 total hours. That's a lot. Shit and nappies in the sea, here's your bonus. Swimmers getting E. coli or dogs getting sick, double it, maybe take some extra time off. Helena, Thames Water has been in the news a lot, and it really is a basket case. I think it's going to be nationalised very soon. But this story of Southern Water shows just how far the con of privatised water really goes.
Yeah, truly is yet another privatization success story in the making. Absolutely. And what's even more crazy about this very specifically, right? Obviously, Macquarie were the main owner of Thames Water that piled up the huge amount of debt that they put on that's now getting them to the point where they might have to get nationalised because they can't service that debt. It was Macquarie's fault when they were in charge. They got booted out in 2017. And now they were allowed, after that, to be able to buy a major stake in Southern Water as well. What the hell is the regulator doing? Why are these wreckers, these people with no incentive whatsoever to actually have the public interest at the heart of their decision making, and who've continually shown to be incredibly profligate managers over all of the water companies that they've had a hold of in this country, how are they allowed to get hold of another company to do it again? It's absolutely crazy to me. I remember you described it when you were having a discussion with Frank Furedi as being the biggest organised theft in this nation's history. And I absolutely agree with this. Because the problem is, as I said, the incentive structures entirely break down with an inelastic commodity like water. There's a reason Michael Burry poured a load of his investments into private water, because you can't live without it, right? The demand is completely inelastic because every single human needs it. And the supply is also inelastic because it's a natural monopoly. So they have no incentive to be able to keep bills down. The only incentive that they have is making money. And if they continue making money in the way that they have done, by taking all of this money on private debt and throwing it over to shareholders and then making customers pay with higher bills in the long run, why wouldn't they give this man a bonus? He's done exactly what the shareholders wanted, which is drive value for them. The only thing, and literally the only thing in this particular market that can stop the private companies doing whatever they want with no regard for the social utility, is the government regulating them and forcing them not to. At a time in which the only reason your private company ever does anything at all in the public good is when the government forces them to do it and essentially runs it by proxy. It's time to start nationalizing these things. It's time to not nationalize. It's time to start nationalizing. It's absolutely ridiculous that this is allowed to continue in the way that it has. Oh, but Helena, you may say, or what about all of the cost to buy off all of the shareholders? We have precedent for this. When it came to the nationalization of Northern Rock, we barely paid shareholders anything. And the specific reason was because once Northern Rock were perceived by the independent adjudicator on the share price to have paid off all of their outstanding liabilities, the share price would have been zero. And we're looking at a bunch of these water companies who do have gigantic liabilities because of debts they've taken on to pay shareholders. I wonder what the share price would be like when an independent adjudicator looks into these numbers too. And at the very least, we'll be able to fund the infrastructure investments we need through general taxation if it's nationalised, which would mostly affect higher earners and the richer, rather than through increased bills, which would affect everybody equally. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Having these in private hands has absolutely failed, and the only option is nationalisation.
I mean, I have to say, I'm quite grateful for this story in a way, because the privatisation of Britain's water industry has done more to discredit capitalism than Novara Media, Karl Marx, Rosa Luxemburg could do put together. Utterly extraordinary. There is actually also just the craziest story with regards to Southern Water, which is the company we're talking about here. They were fined a record £90 million for deliberately dumping billions, I sound like Trump here, billions of litres of untreated sewage in 2020. Billions. Between 16 billion and 21 billion litres of raw sewage were dumped in Sittingbourne, Herne Bay, Whitstable Beaches, Beaulieu River and the New Forest. And the extraordinary thing is, Helena, going back to your point, it's in 2020, they changed management. This guy came in, now he's being rewarded for doing what we don't know really. The extraordinary thing is, the directors of the company knew that was happening. This is described by the presiding justice as criminality. They're fined for breaking the law, and yet the directors aren't struck off. I don't understand. If you're a company director and you know your company is breaking the law and the company is fined tens of millions of pounds, how can you then proceed to go and administer another company? You should clearly be struck off. I mean, frankly, if that was all that happened, you're getting away with it. You should go to prison. That's vandalism, right? Between 16 billion and 21 billion litres of raw sewage illegally. Not legally. And yet if I go down the road, if I go to Southern Water and I get a spray can out and I spray, scum, which, by the way, they are, sorry, maybe that's going to upset some journalists in the national media. Scum, how dare you? Oh my God. Civility and politics. If I sprayed that on parasites, I would be done for criminal damage. But apparently, and it would have a massive impact in terms of my personal life. Good luck me trying to, get a senior job somewhere, some corporate job. But these people can preside over a business putting in 21 billion litres of raw sewage into the New Forest, Beaulieu River, Whitstable Beaches, killing loads of wildlife. Doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Really, we're playing by two very different sets of rules, and these people should have been locked up a very, very long time ago. When it comes to US politics, we're used to Donald Trump being the master of exaggeration. The economy is the greatest in the history of our country. That's an actual quote. The military is the most powerful it's ever been. That's also an actual quote. Regulations have been cut at record rates, and America under Trump was winning like never before under him. Winning so much, in fact, that actually some people want us to stop winning. He also said that too. But it turns out that the president today, Joe Biden, is also pretty good at hyperbole. Here he is speaking about events in Gaza to Speedy Mormon on the Complex YouTube channel.
Well, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. And the Zionist is about whether or not Israel is a safe haven for Jews because of their history of how they've been persecuted.
Are you a Zionist?
Yes. Now, you'll be able to make a lot out of that because people don't know what a Zionist is. Do you know what a Zionist is?
I just ask questions, I don't answer.
By the way, I'm the guy that did more for the Palestinian community than anybody. I'm the guy that opened up all the assets. I'm the guy that made sure that I got the Egyptians to open the border to let good goods through, medicine and food. But what's happening is, and I'm the guy that's been able to pull together the Arab states to agree to help the Palestinians with food and shelter. I'm the guy, and so it's not, I mean,
I'm the guy, and so it's like looking at your phone and there's no battery left. By the way, I'm the guy that did more for the Palestinian community than anybody. I'm the guy. A lot of people are saying it. I'm the guy that did a lot for the Palestinians. But it's not Trump saying it. It's Joe Biden. I got the Egyptians to open the border and let the goods through. I'm the guy that agreed to pull together all the Arab states to help the Palestinians. This is obviously gibberish. I have no idea what he means by opening up all the assets. And look, I may be wrong. Maybe he did something with assets. I don't know. Put it in the comments. Maybe I'm being completely unfair. What I do know is Biden did play something of a role in reopening the Rafah crossing. Okay, one thing he just said there makes some sense. There's just one problem, Joe. Israel keeps bombing the Rafah crossing, including with bombs made in America. And that's the issue here. The Biden administration is Israel's chief ally in a war which has killed at least 40,000 people in Gaza. Maybe many more. In April, his administration approved a bill to provide $26 billion in additional wartime aid to Israel. I'm helping Palestinians so much that I'm funding and financing a genocidal war against them. They love me. And in that interview, Biden talks about getting food into Gaza and how he's responsible for that. Here's the thing, Joe. People in Gaza aren't eating 3 square meals a day. Just last week, the United Nations declared that, quote, famine has spread across the entire Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, he's literally trumpeting his achievements and how good he's been for Palestinians, and people are starving and children are being decapitated. This isn't hyperbole. I'm not exaggerating what he's saying. You saw that clip. It's what came out of his mouth. Now, is this the result of Biden's cognitive decline or just his long-standing views? I suspect it's both. But really, it doesn't matter, because what's important here is that objectively, he has been a disaster for the people of Palestine. But according to Uncle Joe, he's been the best. And like I say, can you imagine if Trump said this and what the response would be? 40,000 people have died and many more are starving, but I've been fantastic for all of them. A lot of people are saying it. The media would rightly highlight how utterly ludicrous that is. We'd hear endless talking points about post-truth and how such a man is a threat to democracy. And yet, when Joe Biden is doing it, crickets, tumbleweed, white noise. Now, this isn't an endorsement of anyone. I obviously think Biden is a better candidate than Trump, particularly from the perspective of the climate agenda. Donald Trump, frankly, wants to burn as many fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But it's genuinely hard to conceive of Trump saying anything more absurd than what we just watched. And that, for me, compounds a really important point. Democrats defending this rhetoric are no better than QAnon. Biden is objectively making no sense. And if you're defending something which sounds like Benjamin Netanyahu's granddad on LSD while suffering from acute sleep deprivation, I can't help you. And it gets to the heart of a phenomenon highlighted by Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks, and that is blue MAGA. Namely, those diehard Democrats that think Uncle Joe can do no wrong, even when a genocide is happening on his watch, which he's helping arm and finance, and approvingly nod when he says he's been such great news for the people of Gaza. Helena, Two questions. Is Blue MAGA a thing? And I know it's boring to say it, but how would the media have responded if Donald Trump had said something so A, utterly incoherent, but B, so profoundly untrue?
I mean, Blue MAGA was 100% a thing. It was 100% a thing. I mean, we saw them all the way back in 2016, right, during the Democratic primaries, going, oh no, the Bernie bros, they're so awful on the internet. How dare they try and smear Hillary Clinton for, all of the things that she's said and done when she was in government, and all of the failures that led to in terms of their election strategy. They're exactly the same as the kind of types that you see with hashtag GTTO in their Twitter bio, for example. The same people who say, well, you can't criticize Keir Starmer on his attitude towards Gaza and Palestine because you're just helping the Conservative Party, in the same way that they'll say the exact same thing. Oh, you can't criticize Joe Biden. You're just helping Trump, right? Are you a secret Trumpist by criticizing Joe Biden? Even ones who internally have some amount of criticism about what's happening in Palestine, who think how awful it is, how unconscionable it is. Oh, well, Joe Biden, he's got no other choice. He's got no choice. He can't really do anything other than just sit here whilst funneling you billions of dollars worth of aid by passing Congress to be able to do it as well. When we already have plenty of evidence that there is plenty of reason with which we know that American presidents have a lot of leverage over pretty profligate Israeli prime ministers from what happened in the 1980s Lebanon war. Reagan calls up, like a GOP president calls up the prime minister of Israel and says, this isn't war, this is a Holocaust. And they say, we'll continue doing it. So this war stops now. And the war was called off 2 days later, right? There was plenty of pressure that the USA could be applying to the Israeli government to try and stop what's happening in Palestine right now, which would be doing more for the Palestinians than anybody else, as he claims wanting to do. But when you look at it, it's clearly nonsense. The other half of the kind of Blue MAGA thing you have going on is the reaction to people saying that Joe Biden should drop out. They are taking it as a personal attack on their personal hero, the man who defeated Donald Trump at the last election, because there's a fear response. There's a fear about what happens when you don't have this large united front, absence of, even basic material criticism, when the biggest criticism of Joe Biden still being the Democratic nominee for this election isn't that, of course, he is bad and he's done loads of bad things, is that he's not going to beat Trump. He's not going to beat Trump. He's not going to beat Trump. All of the Senate races in all of the key swing states, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, right? The Senate candidates are all way ahead, and Joe Biden is behind by all of them. The biggest thing people tell polling companies that they have a problem with about Joe Biden is his age. He absolutely has to drop out. And the Blue MAGA types, they won't hear it. They can't hear any criticism, despite the fact that it's obvious to everybody. And it's going to make their lives worse because they genuinely fear the thing that's going to come to pass if Joe Biden remains the nominee. They're completely divorced from reality, just as you say, are our press, right? When people they believe to be statesman-like, right? That's basically their barometer for whether somebody's word should be taken seriously. Do they act like a statesman? Not that I think that you can necessarily make as much of a case for Joe Biden as you could for someone like Keir Starmer. But anyway, he's far more statesman-like than Donald Trump is. That is their barometer for whether or not you should take their word seriously or not, rather than indeed the content of the things that they do and say. Crazy things like, I've done more things for the Palestinians than anybody else. Nonsense. Complete nonsense. Yet, just like similar criticisms of both Starmer and Johnson were completely ignored by our press, just the same would those criticisms be completely ignored by Joe Biden does it, but would be absolutely jumped upon if Trump was doing it. It's an identical dynamic that's at play within the US press and in the UK press with these issues.
So true. Just quickly as well, we saw that with the shooting of Trump, didn't we? Some of the conspiracy theories immediately coming from people online, and you'd look at their profile, it was like, some Biden stan, 75-year-old grandmother in Illinois, she's got all the Democrat stuff in the bio. You think, oh my God, there's a real parallel here, isn't there? Wednesday will mark the official opening of Parliament by King Charles. And, as is the custom, he'll give a speech outlining the government's legislative commitments for their first Parliament. Government departments are reportedly working on 35 bills to advance Labour's agenda. So, what can we expect to see in the speech? There will almost certainly be legislation to bring into existence Labour's three big ideas looking to encourage investment and growth. Those are the National Wealth Fund, Great British Energy, and the Industrial Strategy Council. The government has also briefed that the speech will contain a new AI bill, setting out regulations around how the emerging technology develops. Then there will probably be constitutional changes, like a little bit of Lords reform, not too much though, don't get worried. There's also the much touted New Deal for working people, though those promises have now been so watered down that one trade union, Unite, refused to sign up to it. But there's one piece of legislation that will be noticeably absent. That's a reversal to the two-child benefit cap. And many Labour MPs and voters aren't happy about it. On BBC Breakfast, Angela Rayner was asked this.
But some of your Labour colleagues think that you should be prioritising this policy. There's even talk this morning that some of them might put down an amendment to the Queen's speech tomorrow to try to make the government do this. What do you say to them? They're not hearing you. They think it's abhorrent and they think you should deal with it.
Well, I accept that people are frustrated and want to, change a lot of things that the Conservatives have done over the last 14 years, but our inheritance is dire. The Chancellor will set out in the coming weeks more of the situation. She's asked all departments to give them the frank information about what's happened. But we've seen unfunded commitments. We've seen the situation, the crisis in our prisons. So we have inherited a really difficult situation. But all I would say is look at what Labour's history and what we do when we're in government. And, as someone who grew up in poverty, I am not prepared to leave office, after a Labour government where we haven't made those significant changes. And child poverty is an issue for us. And we're absolutely appalled that children haven't got beds to sleep in at night. This is the 21st century. This shouldn't be the situation we're in, but this is the inheritance that the Conservatives have left us, and we will continue to tackle those issues.
Angela Rayner would like to see the benefit cap gone by the end of a Labour government, but that's probably more than a decade away. And to give you a sense of the damage the legislation continues to do to children in this country, the Child Poverty Action Group has published a new study containing testimony from families crushed by it. This is really extraordinary. A single parent with 3 children told the study this. I can no longer afford to pay for necessities such as clothes, food and household bills, and I cannot pay for school trips or any activities my children would like to take part in. The benefit cap has affected my and my children's lives in an extremely negative way. I pray every day that the cap will be lifted so that my children can enjoy the same experiences other children their age do. Elsewhere, a working couple with 4 children said this. My number one reason for doing anything is my children, yet when I watch them queuing in a food bank with me because I physically can't provide for them, I feel horrific. It makes you feel like an absolute failure. And a single mother with 4 children told the report this. I can't work as I'm disabled. My children's father died suddenly, so I've had to claim benefits for my 3 children. I don't get any benefits for my youngest child, and so it's hard to budget as little ones grow so quickly and do cost money. Money is tight. Apparently that stuff doesn't matter. I mean, at least Angela Rayner is pretending to care about it. I'm sure she does care about it. But this stuff apparently was cheered on by much of the political class, let's be honest, for 10 years. Helena, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because I do believe Angela Rayner's sincerity in when she says, I want to bring child poverty down. I don't dispute that for one moment. But that message of we can't afford to do anything about it is so much more digestible when it's coming from the mouth of somebody who says, I've experienced child poverty firsthand, than from somebody that looks, sounds, and has the experience of Jeremy Hunt or George Osborne. What's your view?
I mean, the issue, of course, is that it's just a choice that they've made. It's not something that they can't do. It's something that they won't do. It's very deliberate. We just saw bond yields, 2-year bond yields have just gone below 4% yields today. And so the idea that the Labour economy that they've inherited is still crashed from Liz Truss is completely nonsensical, right? This kind of blaming of the inheritance just won't wash as far as I'm concerned. But you're right. It does seem far more digestible from somebody essentially kind of, I hate to say, betraying her own communities, because these are the people who are going to be most affected by it. And she was somebody who needed the help of the welfare state, quite rightly that it was given to her when she was a single mother at 16. So to see her essentially be the one kind of wheeled out by the Labour leadership to defend this, to defend what is in utilitarian terms an indefensible policy is pretty disheartening to be able to see. The issue, of course, is that they're not doing this because they think that it's good. They're doing it because they think that it is an optical win for them. So no matter how many times you try and tell people about why that this cap should go, it's good for overall economic growth, if more people are spending money in the economy, especially those who wouldn't otherwise be consuming because they're destitute. It would reduce poverty, which is good kind of prima facie. It would be cheaper in the long run. We wouldn't have to deal with the afterward health effects of having a poor childhood. We'd have a more productive economy later by having better educated children. Well-fed children are much easier to educate. Every single study shows this. But you can say this as much as you want, but the people that this policy is meant to appeal to don't care. I was watching a debate on Channel 5. It was Michael Walker versus Esther Cracky talking about this. And it really got me thinking about the ways in which you can't really argue with the supporters of this policy because they have a different, complete idea about what the role of policy is for. Us here over on the left, we usually think of policy in utilitarian terms. We say, what utility does this policy solve? Does this policy do? And if it doesn't create a positive utility, we should get rid of the policy. That's how we've kind of looked at the two-child benefit gap in terms of growth, in terms of human outcomes, in terms of overall funding for the exchequer, for example. And we've just come to that conclusion, said that it's bad. But for a lot of people on the political right, or more conservative, even if they're not necessarily kind of right-wing economically, more broadly in terms of the structure of the economy, the policies and the laws and the way that the government makes the way our structure of society works isn't about utility, it's about morality. It's a legislation of morality. And so something like the two-child benefit cap, they'll say things like, well, we shouldn't be permissive of the idea that somebody should have a third child and expect the state to cover it. So this would be a disincentive, for example. But the same Child Poverty Action Group reporting on the two-child benefit cap has shown it's not really led to that much of a disfertility effect at all. It's not actually stopping people having the children, which, by the way, we need. We have a declining birth rate. People need to have children in this country to keep our economy and our society afloat. They're trying to disincentivize that, and it's not even working anyway. All they're doing is creating more child poverty. But unless you can get round that kind of philosophical disagreement between the left and the right's view of this particular policy, we can scream until we're blue in the face about the evidence, but it just won't wash with them, because at the end of the day, they'll either say, well, it doesn't matter to me, I don't want them to be permissive, or a caller to this particular show I watched said things like, oh, well, that's just because, the people for the parents are spending money on these frivolous things that aren't necessary, like the latest gadgets or Sky TV or Netflix or whatever. And of course, I'm sure that the 30% of this country's children that are in poverty, their parents all just immediately decided in unison in a little WhatsApp chat to decide to not feed their children as soon as the Conservative government took power in 2010. But that's by the by. And you see this on loads of other different policies, like with drug reform. I don't want the state to be permissive of the usage of drugs, even though decriminalisation has been shown in countries like Portugal to have much better societal outcomes. And that is unfortunately a philosophical disagreement that we're not going to be able to get round. And the Labour Party have decided they don't want to have a fight over, and they're just going to acquiesce to it, even though they know that it's bad.
That's exactly right. And I think that people talk about the costs of paying for this is about £2.5 billion a year. The costs of not doing it are just massive. And getting to a point about low birth rates, Helena, many people would like more children. They simply can't afford it for a bunch of reasons. But imagine if you're a woman in your 30s, you've had one child. By the way, it's really hard work. I say that as a dad of an 8-month-old. Really hard work. And, your partner is saying, let's have a second or let's have a third. Well, and if you rent, you think, well, if you're not around in 5 years, God willing, something doesn't happen to you. But if it does, and we go for a third child, I'm not going to do it because I know the state isn't going to have my back. I would be immiserated. Just such an awful policy. And just to repeat, many of the people in receipt of these policies, in receipt of what they should get, and they're not getting, it's been pulled, these are working households. Child poverty is such a huge issue in this country. And I was actually looking at some of the national data. Somewhere like Hastings or Southampton, 35% of kids are being raised in poverty. It's not just, the West Midlands, bits of London. It's pretty much the whole country has a major problem with child poverty. Any city has massive issues with child poverty. And it's like we're not even taking it seriously. And it's storing up such extraordinary problems for decades. We can talk about that for several hours. We won't. Maybe another time. Helena, thanks for joining me this evening.
Always a pleasure, Aaron. Thank you very much for having me.
It was always a pleasure. Very interesting stories tonight. And thanks everyone for watching too. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.